The prestigious restaurant buzzed with the soft hum of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the faint melodies of classical music drifting from the corner where a live pianist played. The ambience exuded elegance, with its marble floors polished to a mirror like sheen and chandeliers that sparkled like constellations above the well-dressed patrons. Amidst this orchestrated harmony, a young waitress, Kira Evans, maneuvered her way between tables, balancing a tray loaded with champagne flutes. Her posture was tense, her steps measured, as if every movement carried the weight of her entire existence. Kira was not meant for this world of opulence. Her uniform, though crisp and clean, hung on her slight frame like armor she wore to survive the battle of each shift. The glances from the guests varied. Some barely noticed her, while others offered disapproving looks at any perceived falter in her performance. She was used to this, numb to the subtle cruelties that came with serving people who lived lives so vastly different from her own. But tonight felt heavier than usual, and Kira couldn't shake the feeling that she was teetering on the edge of something unknown. At a corner table, Henry Lawson sat surrounded by a group of influential businessmen. Henry was a man whose very presence commanded attention. In his early 50s, with streaks of silver in his perfectly combed hair, he exuded an air of authority that had been forged through decades of ruthless deals and calculated risks. His tailored suit fit him like a second skin, and his sharp blue eyes scanned the room with a predator's precision. To those who knew him, Henry Lawson was a figure to be feared, respected, and envied, a man who had built his empire brick by brick, often at the expense of those less shrewd or fortunate. Despite the laughter and clinking glasses at his table, Henry's mind was elsewhere. The chatter of his companions barely registered as his gaze drifted aimlessly around the room. Lately, the thrill of success had begun to wane. The empire he had built, the luxuries he surrounded himself with, even the power he wielded, all of it felt hollow. There was a void inside him, one he refused to acknowledge but could never quite escape. It was in this restless state that Henry's eyes fell on Kira as she navigated through the sea of tables. At first, she was just another faceless employee, another part of the scenery. But something about her caught his attention. Her movements, though precise, betrayed a nervous energy that struck him as unusual. Then, his gaze drifted to the small pendant that hung from her neck, a simple medallion with a weathered, intricate design. Henry's heart skipped a beat. The medallion was unmistakable. He had seen it before, many years ago, around the neck of his late wife, Emma. The memories surged forth unbidden: Emma's laughter, her defiant spirit, and the quiet pain she had carried in the last years of her life. The sight of that medallion, now worn by this young waitress, felt like a ripple in the fabric of time, an echo of a past he had long buried. Kira felt the weight of Henry's gaze before she saw him. She looked up, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment. There was something in his expression, curiosity mixed with a kind of shock, that made her uneasy. She quickly looked away, focusing on her tray and the task at hand. But the unease lingered, and she found herself stealing glances at the man who seemed unable to look anywhere else. The moment was broken as Kira approached a nearby table and bent to serve a glass of champagne. A sudden misstep, perhaps her heel catching on the plush carpet, sent the tray tipping. The glasses tumbled, shattering on the floor with a piercing crash that silenced the room. Kira froze, her breath hitching as every eye in the restaurant turned toward her. Heat rushed to her face, and her hands trembled as she bent down to pick up the shards of glass. Her manager was already rushing toward her, his expression a mix of anger and mortification. "I'm so sorry," Kira stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Before her manager could unleash the reprimand she expected, Henry stood from his table. His chair scraped against the marble floor, the sound cutting through the tense silence. All eyes shifted to him as he approached Kira, his imposing figure towering over her. "Leave it," Henry said, his voice calm but firm. Kira looked up at him, startled. Her manager hesitated, his frustration giving way to confusion as he stepped back. Henry crouched down, picking up one of the larger pieces of broken glass and examining it as if it held some deeper significance. Then, his gaze shifted to the medallion around Kira's neck. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his tone low and deliberate. Kira instinctively clutched the medallion, her fingers curling around it protectively. "It's mine," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around her. Henry's eyes narrowed, the intensity of his stare making her feel as though he could see straight through her. "It belonged to someone I knew," he said, his voice barely above a murmur. Kira stood, straightening her posture as if bracing herself for a fight. "I don't know you," she said, her tone edged with defiance. "And this medallion has nothing to do with you." Henry's expression darkened, but he didn't press further. He stepped back, allowing her to retreat. Kira quickly excused herself, disappearing into the kitchen as the murmurs of the restaurant began to rise again. As Henry returned to his table, his companions bombarded him with questions, but he waved them off, his thoughts consumed by the waitress and the medallion. He couldn't shake the feeling that the universe had just thrown him a puzzle piece to a mystery he hadn't realized he was trying to solve. In the dimly lit kitchen, Kira leaned against the counter, her heart pounding. She clutched the medallion tightly, her mind racing. The man's words echoed in her head, and for the first time, she wondered if the medallion held secrets she was not yet ready to uncover. Unbeknownst to both of them, this chance encounter was only the beginning of a story that would unravel their lives, bringing buried truths to light and forcing them to confront the ghosts of their pasts. Kira's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the counter in the kitchen. The medallion she always wore felt heavier now, the cool metal pressing against her skin. Her heart still raced from the scene in the dining room. She had embarrassed herself before a room full of people who would forget her face by morning, but not him. Not the man who had stared at her as though she were the missing piece to a puzzle he had been trying to solve for years. His questions rang in her mind, loud and unshakable. "Where did you get that? Who gave it to you?" She didn't owe him any answers, but something in his tone made her feel as if she had just stepped into the middle of a story that wasn't entirely her own. The kitchen was bustling as usual, but Kira barely registered the movement of the other staff around her. The crash of the tray, the sharp sting of humiliation, and the weight of that man's piercing stare replayed in her head, like a record she couldn't turn off. She had spent her entire life being invisible, blending into the background wherever she went. But tonight, for reasons she couldn't begin to understand, it felt like the universe had singled her out. She reached up and clutched the medallion tightly, as if it could anchor her to something stable. She had no memory of a time before this necklace. It was the only thing that tied her to a mother she couldn't remember, a past that had been stolen from her by tragedy and time. She had asked about it once, years ago, when she was still a child at the orphanage. The headmistress had been kind but vague, saying only that it had been left with her as a baby, along with a note that had long since been lost. "It must have been from someone who loved you very much," the woman had said, her voice tinged with pity. But what kind of love leaves a child behind? Kira had stopped asking questions after that. The door to the kitchen slammed open, jolting Kira out of her thoughts. She turned to see her manager storming toward her, his face twisted in fury. "What the hell was that out there?" he hissed, his voice low enough not to carry but sharp enough to cut. Kira flinched. "Do you have any idea who that man is?" "That's Henry Lawson, for God's sake. You think someone like him is going to tolerate this kind of incompetence? Do you want to lose your job tonight? Because that's exactly what's going to happen if you can't keep it together." "I'm sorry," Kira muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sorry doesn't cut it," the manager snapped. Clean yourself up and stay out of sight for the rest of the night. I don't need any more disasters." With that, he turned on his heel and stalked off, leaving Kiera standing there, the sting of his words settling into her bones. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to tell him that this job didn't mean half as much to her as he seemed to think. But she swallowed it down, the way she always did. She had learned long ago that people like him, the ones with power, even the smallest kind, would always see her as disposable. It was easier to let them think they were right. The kitchen quieted slightly as the dinner rush began to wind down. Kiera busied herself cleaning plates and polishing silverware, trying to focus on the repetitive tasks that usually soothed her nerves. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her skin prickled, and she glanced toward the swinging doors that led to the dining room. The man Henry Lawson was standing just beyond them, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim light of the restaurant. Kiera's breath caught in her throat as he stepped into the kitchen, his sharp eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. He moved with a quiet authority, the kind that came naturally to someone who had spent a lifetime commanding attention. The other staff froze, their gazes darting between Henry and Kiera, but no one said a word. "Kiera," he said, his voice low and measured. Her name sounded strange coming from his mouth, like it didn't quite belong there. She straightened her back, her hands tightening around the cloth she had been using to dry a plate. "What do you want?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I need to ask you something," Henry said, stepping closer. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his words filled the room. "That medallion you wear, where did you get it?" Kiera's fingers instinctively flew to the necklace, curling around it protectively. "Why does it matter?" she shot back, her tone defensive. "Because I've seen it before," Henry replied, his gaze unwavering. "It belonged to someone I cared about, someone I lost a long time ago." Kiera blinked, her mind reeling. What was he talking about? Her medallion was hers. It had always been hers. She had carried it through every foster home, every heartbreak, every lonely night. It was the one constant in a life that had been anything but stable. And now this man, the stranger, was standing here, acting like he had some kind of claim to it. "It's mine," she said firmly. "I don't know what you think you know, but this medallion has nothing to do with you." Henry frowned, his jaw tightening. "I'm not trying to accuse you of anything," he said, his tone softening. "But that medallion, wherever you got it, it has a story, and I think you deserve to know it." Kiera hesitated. She wanted to tell him to leave her alone, to take his questions and his piercing gaze and go back to his world of tailored suits and fine dining. But something in his voice stopped her. There was a sincerity there, a kind of raw vulnerability that she hadn't expected. "It was left with me when I was a baby," she said finally, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "At the orphanage. They said it was probably from my mother, but I don't know for sure. That's all I know." Henry's face softened, and for a moment Kiera thought she saw something like pain flicker in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off. "Look," she said, her voice hardening, "I don't know who you are or why you care so much about this necklace, but I'm not interested in whatever story you're trying to tell me. It's my life, and I'm doing just fine without answers from someone like you." Henry nodded slowly, as if he were trying to process her words. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to upset you, but this isn't over, Kiera. Not yet." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. She watched the door swing shut behind him, the silence in the room almost deafening. As the hours passed and the restaurant emptied out, Kiera couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just changed in a way she didn't fully understand. That man Henry Lawson wasn't going to let this go, and deep down, as much as she hated to admit it, a part of her didn't want him to. The city was a living thing at night, its heartbeat the rumble of cars on wet streets, its breath the soft hum of neon signs and the muffled conversations spilling out of bars and late-night diners. Kira walked briskly, her hands shoved deep into her jacket pockets. She wanted to disappear into the shadows, away from the weight of the evening's events. Her head throbbed with the questions she refused to fully confront. Why had Henry Lawson seemed so sure her medallion mattered? And why had she felt, in some strange, inexplicable way, that it did? The medallion pressed against her chest, heavier than ever. It was the only thing that connected her to the mother she had never known, the only proof that someone had loved her once, even if they hadn't stayed. And yet tonight, it had been a magnet for something she didn't understand, a force that had drawn Henry to her with an intensity she couldn't shake. She reached her apartment, a small, crumbling walk-up that smelled faintly of mildew and stale smoke. The overhead light in the hallway flickered as she climbed the stairs, each creak of the wooden steps echoing in the silence. Her door was at the end of the corridor, chipped paint peeling away from the number 8. She unlocked it with a sigh, pushing the door open into the familiar chaos of her tiny home. The apartment was a testament to survival. The mismatched furniture had been scavenged from second-hand stores. The walls were bare, except for a single faded photograph of a smiling young woman, her mother. She assumed, though she couldn't be sure. The medallion had hung around the woman's neck in the photo, glinting faintly in the sunlight. Kira had spent hours staring at that picture as a child, imagining the sound of the woman's laughter, the warmth of her arms. But the memories never came. She dropped her bag onto the couch and sat down heavily, running a hand through her hair. The events of the night churned in her mind, refusing to settle. Henry Lawson. His name carried weight, even for someone like her who had long stopped paying attention to the powerful people who ruled the world from behind their gated mansions and skyscrapers. He had looked at her like he'd seen a ghost. And then there were his words. That medallion belonged to someone I cared about. Someone I lost. Kira shook her head, standing abruptly. She didn't want to think about him anymore. She didn't want to think about any of it. She had spent years burying the questions that haunted her, and she wasn't about to dig them up now just because some rich stranger thought her necklace was important. But as she moved toward the small kitchen, a faint noise stopped her in her tracks. A shuffle. A creak. Her pulse quickened, her senses suddenly sharp. The apartment was silent except for the distant hum of traffic outside, but she was certain she had heard something. Kira. Her blood turned to ice. The voice was muffled but unmistakable, Henry's voice, coming from the other side of her door. She crept toward it, her bare feet soundless on the worn floorboards. "What do you want?" she called out, her voice sharp and steady despite the panic clawing at her chest. There was a pause. Then, "I just want to talk." "Talk?" she repeated, incredulous. "You followed me home to talk? Are you insane?" "I didn't follow you," Henry replied, his tone calm but firm. "I asked your manager for your address." Kira's hand tightened on the doorknob, her anger flaring. "That's supposed to make this better. You had no right." "I know," he interrupted, his voice softening. "I know I overstepped. But I need answers, Kira. And I think you do too." Something in his tone gave her pause. It wasn't the commanding voice he'd used in the kitchen, the one that brooked no argument. This was different, quieter, almost pleading. Against her better judgment, she unlocked the door and pulled it open, just enough to see him standing there in the dim light of the hallway. He looked different now, stripped of the imposing aura he'd carried earlier. His suit jacket was gone, his tie loosened, and there was an exhaustion in his eyes that made him seem almost human. "You have 5 minutes," Kira said, her voice cold. "Then I'm calling the cops." Henry nodded, stepping inside. The space was so small that his presence seemed to fill it entirely, making the air feel heavy. He glanced around, his gaze lingering on the photograph of Kira's mother. "That's her, isn't it?" he asked, his voice quiet. Kira stiffened. "What do you mean?" "The woman in the photo," he said, gesturing toward it. "She's the one who gave you the medallion." Kira hesitated, her fingers brushing against the pendant. "I don't know," she admitted reluctantly. "She's just someone. The orphanage said she was my mother, but I don't remember her. I don't even know her name." Henry stepped closer, his eyes locked on the photo. "Emma," he said softly, the word trembling on his lips. Kira frowned. "What?" "Her name was Emma," he said, turning to face her. "Emma Lawson. She was my wife." The world seemed to tilt beneath Kira's feet. She stared at him, her mind struggling to process the weight of his words. "You're lying," she said finally, her voice shaking. "I'm not," Henry said, his gaze unwavering. "That medallion, it was hers. I gave it to her on our wedding day." Kira stumbled back, her legs hitting the edge of the couch. "No," she said, shaking her head. "This doesn't make sense. If she was your wife, why would she leave me in an orphanage? Why wouldn't she?" "She never told me," Henry interrupted, his voice raw with emotion. "I didn't know. I didn't even know she had a child." Kira's head spun as the pieces of a puzzle she had never known existed began to fall into place. The medallion, the photograph, the orphanage, everything she had clung to as a fragile connection to her past, suddenly felt like part of a larger story, one she didn't fully understand. "Why now?" she demanded, her anger rising to mask the fear and confusion threatening to overwhelm her. "Why come looking for answers now? She's been dead for years. Why didn't you care then?" Henry flinched, his expression pained. "Because I didn't know," he said quietly. "When Emma died, I thought I had lost everything. But now I realize I didn't just lose her. I lost you too. And I can't walk away without trying to make things right." Kira stared at him, her chest heaving with the effort to hold back tears. She wanted to believe him, but the scars of her past made it impossible to trust anyone, especially a man who had appeared out of nowhere, claiming to be the father she had spent her whole life resenting. "I don't need you to make anything right," she said finally, her voice cold and sharp. "I've done just fine on my own." Henry nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. "I understand," he said. "But if you ever change your mind, if you ever want to know the truth, I'll be here." He turned and walked out the door, leaving Kira alone in the suffocating silence of her apartment. She sank onto the couch, clutching the medallion tightly as tears streamed down her face. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to have a family, to belong. But the wounds of her past were deep, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to let them heal. The rain was relentless, a steady drumming against the city that seemed to amplify the chaos in Kira's mind. She sat on the edge of her bed, the medallion dangling from her fingers as she stared at it, willing it to give her answers it had never provided. The storm outside mirrored her turmoil. Henry's words haunted her. Emma Lawson. She was my wife. The name rang in her head like a bell she couldn't unhear, and yet it felt distant, foreign. If Henry was telling the truth, and a small, stubborn part of her wanted to believe he wasn't épée, meant her mother had lived a life Kira couldn't fathom. A life of wealth, power, and privilege. And if that was true, then why had Kira been abandoned, left to grow up in a string of foster homes and orphanages, where love was scarce and survival was everything? The anger that had sustained her for years burned hot in her chest, but beneath it was something she couldn't name. A quiet, aching hope. The envelope lay on the nightstand where she had left it the night before. Henry had slipped it under her door after their confrontation, a gesture she had considered ignoring entirely. But the storm had kept her awake, and the unanswered questions had gnawed at her. With a reluctant sigh, she picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a photograph. It was old, the edges worn and faded. In it, a young woman with bright eyes and a radiant smile stood in a sunlit garden. The medallion was unmistakable around her neck, catching the light as though it were a beacon. Beside her was a man, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. Henry. He looked younger, less worn by time, but there was no mistaking him. On the back of the photograph, in delicate handwriting, were the words, "Emma and Henry, 1992. Kira's throat tightened as she ran her thumb over the writing. It was her mother. The realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave, sweeping away the doubts she had clung to. Her mother had been real, not just a faded memory or a distant figure in an old photo. She had lived. She had loved. And somehow, she had been connected to this man who had turned Kira's life upside down. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her out of her thoughts. She picked it up hesitantly, her pulse quickening when she saw Henry's name on the screen. She had given him her number reluctantly, more out of a need to end their last conversation than a desire to stay in contact. "Kira," his voice came through the line, steady but laced with tension. "Thank you for answering." "What do you want?" she asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "I know you don't trust me," he said, his tone calm but urgent. "And I don't blame you. But I think there's something you need to see. Something that might help you understand." "Understand what?" she snapped. "The truth," he said simply. Kira hesitated. Every instinct she had told her to hang up, to shut him out and protect herself. But the photograph in her hand told a different story. The medallion, the garden, the words on the back, they were pieces of a puzzle she couldn't ignore. "Where?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry waited for her outside a small cafe on the edge of the city, his figure hunched slightly against the cold wind. He looked out of place there, his tailored coat and polished shoes at odds with the rundown storefronts and cracked pavement. Kira approached slowly, her steps hesitant, her hands buried deep in her pockets. "You came," Henry said, his expression softening as he straightened. "Don't make me regret it," she replied, brushing past him and into the cafe. The interior was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of coffee and stale pastries. They took a table in the corner, away from the other patrons, and Kira crossed her arms defensively as she waited for him to speak. Henry reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. He placed it on the table between them, his hand lingering on it for a moment before sliding it toward her. "What is this?" Kira asked, eyeing the journal warily. "It was Emma's," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "She kept it during the last few years of her life. I didn't know it existed until recently." Kira hesitated, her fingers hovering over the journal. She wanted to open it, to see her mother's words, but fear held her back. What if it revealed things she didn't want to know? What if it confirmed that she had been unwanted, a mistake that had been abandoned without a second thought? "Why now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because I owe you the truth," Henry said simply. "And because I think you deserve to know who your mother was." Kira swallowed hard and opened the journal. The pages were filled with neat, looping handwriting, accompanied by small sketches of flowers and landscapes. She flipped through them slowly, her heart pounding as she absorbed fragments of her mother's thoughts. "I miss the garden. It was always my refuge, my safe place. Henry is so focused on the business. I wish he would see me again, the way he used to. I'm scared. I don't know if I'm strong enough to do this alone." Kira's breath caught as she reached a page where the writing had become hurried and frantic. "I can't stay. It's not safe. They'll come after me if they find out. But how can I leave her? How can I leave my baby?" Her hands trembled as she turned the page, the words blurring as tears filled her eyes. "I have to protect her. Even if it means she hates me someday, I have to keep her safe. Kira closed the journal abruptly, her chest heaving as she struggled to contain the storm of emotions inside her. The cafe seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing down as her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Kira," Henry said softly, his voice pulling her back to the present. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know." She looked up at him, her vision blurred with tears. She was scared, she whispered. She was running from something. From someone. "And you didn't notice?" Henry's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as he nodded. "I was blind," he admitted. "I was so consumed by the business, by the pressure to succeed, that I didn't see what was happening right in front of me. And by the time I realized, it was too late." Kira pushed the journal back toward him, her anger flaring again. "So what? You think you can fix this now? That you can waltz back into my life and make everything better because you feel guilty?" "No," Henry said firmly. "I can't fix the past. But I can be here now, if you'll let me." Kira stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. She couldn't do this. The journal, the memories, the man sitting across from her, it was all too much. She needed air. She needed to get away. "Wait," Henry called after her as she turned to leave. "Please, Kira. There's more." She froze, her back to him. What more could there possibly be? "There's someone else you need to meet," he said, his voice hesitant. "Someone who can tell you when some." Kira turned slowly, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Who?" Henry hesitated, then said a name that sent a chill down her spine. A name she hadn't heard since she was a child at the orphanage. "Margaret Shaw," he said quietly. "She was Emma's closest friend, and she might be the only one who knows the whole story." Kira stared at him, her heart pounding. The name was a lifeline, a thread that connected her to a past she had thought was lost forever. She didn't know if she could trust him, but for the first time she felt the faintest flicker of hope. "Fine," she said finally. "Take me to her." Henry nodded, relief washing over his face. "You won't regret this," he said. But as they left the cafe and stepped into the rain, Kira couldn't shake the feeling that the answer she was searching for might cost her more than she was ready to give. The sky above the city was a bruised shade of gray, heavy with the promise of rain. Kira sat stiffly in the passenger seat of Henry's sleek black car, her hands clenched in her lap. The leather interior smelled faintly of cedar and polish, too pristine for someone like her. She stared out the window, watching the city blur by as they drove toward the address Henry had given her. Margaret Shaw. The name echoed in her mind like a distant bell, stirring faint memories she couldn't quite grasp. Henry was silent as he drove, his jaw tight, his grip on the steering wheel firm. She had barely spoken since she agreed to meet this woman, and the tension between them was palpable. Kira wasn't sure what to expect. She wasn't even sure why she had agreed to come. But something about the way Henry had spoken her name, the urgency in his voice, had made her relent. She wanted answers, even if part of her was terrified of what she might find. They turned onto a quiet street lined with modest houses, their facades weathered but well kept. Henry slowed the car as they approached a small white house with a neatly trimmed lawn and a faded blue door. He parked at the curb and turned to Kira, his expression cautious. "She's been waiting for us," he said quietly. Kira didn't respond. She pushed the door open and stepped out, the cool air biting at her skin. Henry followed, and together they walked up the path to the front door. He hesitated for a moment before knocking, the sound sharp and deliberate. The door opened a crack, and an older woman with sharp eyes and graying hair peered out. Her gaze flicked from Henry to Kira, and her lips parted in a faint gasp. She opened the door wider, revealing a petite frame wrapped in a cardigan that looked like it had seen better days. "Henry," she said, her voice steady but tinged with something unspoken. Then her eyes settled on Kira, and her breath hitched. "Oh my." "This is Kira," Henry said gently. Emma's daughter. The woman's face softened, and she reached out instinctively, her hand trembling slightly. "You look just like her," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Just like Emma." Kira flinched at the raw intensity of the woman's words but didn't pull away. "You knew her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded, stepping aside to let them in. "Come inside," she said. "There's a lot you need to hear." The house was cozy, cluttered with knickknacks and photographs that told the story of a life well lived. Margaret led them into the living room, where an old couch sagged invitingly beneath a faded quilt. Kira sat down, her gaze darting around the room, while Henry took a seat across from her, his posture rigid. Margaret sat in an armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with anticipation, until Margaret finally broke it. "I met Emma when we were both young," she began, her voice soft but steady. "She was full of life, always laughing, always dreaming. She had a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the world. And when she met Henry, I thought she had found her fairy tale." Henry's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Margaret's gaze shifted to Kira, her eyes filled with sadness. "But life isn't a fairy tale, is it? Emma loved Henry deeply, but she was scared. The world he lived in, the people he surrounded himself with, they weren't kind. They weren't safe." Kira frowned, her hands gripping the edge of the couch. "What do you mean?" Margaret hesitated, glancing at Henry as if seeking his permission. He gave a slight nod, his expression grim. "She was pregnant," Margaret said finally, her voice trembling. "With you." Kira's breath caught, and she stared at the older woman, her mind racing. She had always assumed her mother's reasons for leaving her were selfish, but now... She wanted to tell Henry, Margaret continued, her gaze flicking to him. But she was afraid. She said there were powerful people who wouldn't let her have a child in peace. She said they would use her, use you as leverage. So she made the hardest decision of her life. She ran. Henry's face was pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest of his chair. "I didn't know," he said, his voice rough. "I swear to you, Kira, I didn't know." Kira felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Her entire life she had carried the weight of abandonment, of never feeling wanted. And now she was being told that her mother had left her not out of neglect, but out of fear, to protect her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up outside. Margaret froze, her expression shifting to one of fear. "Did anyone see you come here?" she asked, her voice urgent. Henry frowned, glancing toward the window. "No, why?" Before Margaret could answer, the front door burst open, and two men in dark suits stormed in. One was broad-shouldered with a scar running down his cheek, the other lean and wiry with sharp, calculating eyes. Kira's heart leapt into her throat as they scanned the room, their expressions cold and menacing. "Mr. Lawson," the scarred man said, his voice low and gravelly, "we've been looking for you." Henry rose slowly, his hands clenched into fists. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling," he said coolly. "This isn't a request," the man replied, pulling a gun from his jacket. "You've been digging into things that don't concern you. It's time to stop." Kira's breath came in shallow gasps as the wiry man stepped forward, his gaze settling on her. "And this must be the girl," he said with a sneer. "The little secret that's caused all this trouble." Henry moved to block their view of her, his body tense. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice steady but deadly. "Leave now, and we can forget this happened." The scarred man chuckled darkly. "It's too late for that." Before anyone could react, Margaret lunged forward, swinging a heavy ceramic lamp at the wiry man's head. The lamp shattered on impact, and he crumpled to the floor with a groan. The scarred man turned his gun on her, but Henry was faster. He tackled the man to the ground, the gun skidding across the floor. "Kiera, run!" Margaret shouted, her voice piercing through the chaos. But Kiera couldn't move. She was frozen, her mind racing as Henry wrestled with the scarred man, their grunts and the sound of breaking furniture filling the room. The wiry man began to stir, clutching his head as he tried to rise. Margaret grabbed Kiera's arm, pulling her toward the back door. "We have to go," she said urgently. Kiera stumbled after her, her legs feeling like lead. They burst out into the backyard, the cold night air stinging her face. Margaret pushed her toward a narrow alley that ran behind the houses, her voice trembling. "There's a safe place a few blocks from here. We'll go there." A gunshot rang out, cutting her off. Kiera whipped around, her heart hammering in her chest. Henry stumbled out of the house, his face pale but determined. "Go," he shouted, waving them forward. Kiera hesitated, her feet rooted to the ground. She couldn't leave him. Not now. Not after everything. Margaret grabbed her arm again, pulling her forward. "He'll catch up," she said. "We have to move." Kiera let herself be dragged into the darkness, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She didn't know who these men were or why they wanted to hurt them. But one thing was clear. The truth she had been searching for was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The rain came down in sheets as Kiera sprinted through the narrow alley, her breath hitching with every step. The echoes of gunshots still rang in her ears, a sharp counterpoint to the pounding of her heart. Margaret gripped her wrist tightly, pulling her forward, her own fear etched into every line of her face. The streets were empty at this hour, the world reduced to the harsh rhythm of their footsteps on the slick pavement. Kiera's mind raced, tangled in a storm of confusion and terror. She could barely comprehend what had just happened to the armed men, their threats, Henry's fight to protect them. And now, she was running through the night with a woman she barely knew, fleeing from a danger she didn't understand. Margaret skidded to a stop at the mouth of another alley, glancing over her shoulder. Her face was pale, her breath shallow. "We're almost there," she panted, her voice low. "Just a few more blocks." Kiera nodded numbly, following as Margaret led them through a maze of back streets and side paths. At last they emerged in front of a crumbling old warehouse, its windows dark and its facade scarred with years of neglect. Margaret yanked open a rusted side door and ushered Kiera inside. The air was cold and damp, the faint scent of mildew lingering in the shadows. Margaret closed the door behind them, leaning against it as she struggled to catch her breath. "We'll be safe here for now?" she said, her voice trembling. Kiera paced the small room, her nerves raw. "Safe from who?" she demanded, her voice sharp with anger and fear. "Who are those men? What do they want with us?" Margaret hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It's not you they're after," she said quietly. "It's Henry." Kiera froze, the weight of Margaret's words sinking in. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret sighed, running a hand through her graying hair. "Because he's digging into things they don't want uncovered. The people Emma was running from, they didn't disappear after she died. They've been waiting, watching. And now that Henry is asking questions, they see him as a threat." Kiera's stomach churned. "And me?" she asked. "What do I have to do with any of this?" Margaret looked at her with a sadness that made Kiera's chest tighten. "You're a part of Emma's story," she said simply. "And now they think you're a part of Henry's." The door creaked suddenly, and Kiera spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. But it wasn't one of the men, it was Henry. He stumbled inside, soaked to the bone and clutching his side. His face was pale, his breath shallow. "Henry." Margaret rushed to his side, guiding him to a nearby chair. "You're hurt." "I'm fine," he muttered through gritted teeth, though the crimson stain spreading across his shirt told a different story. Kiera hovered nearby, her hands shaking. "What happened?" she demanded. Henry looked up at her, his blue eyes filled with a mix of pain and determination. "They won't stop," he said hoarsely. "Not until they're sure I won't uncover the truth." Margaret began unbuttoning his shirt, revealing a deep gash along his ribs. "We need to stop the bleeding," she said, grabbing a rag from a nearby shelf. "Stay still." As Margaret worked, Kira paced the room, her mind racing. "This is insane," she said, her voice trembling. "Why are they so desperate to keep us from finding out what happened? What's so dangerous about the truth?" Henry winced as Margaret pressed the rag against his wound. "Because the truth could ruin them," he said. Emma wasn't just running from random enemies. She was running from people who were willing to destroy her to protect themselves. People who are still pulling the strings. Kira stared at him, her anger bubbling to the surface. "You keep saying that, but you still haven't told me what it is they're hiding. What did my mother know that was so dangerous?" Henry hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know," he admitted. "Not yet. But I know where to find the answers." Kira's heart pounded. "Where?" Henry's gaze locked onto hers, his jaw tightening. "Emma kept a journal," he said. "A second one, hidden away. She told Margaret about it before she left. If we can find it, we'll know the truth." Margaret nodded. "It's at the old house," she said. "The one Emma and Henry lived in before everything fell apart. She hid it there." Kira's pulse quickened. "Then let's go get it." "No," Henry said sharply, his voice firm despite his weakened state. "It's too dangerous. They'll be watching the house." Kira crossed her arms, her eyes blazing. "So what? We're supposed to just hide here while they keep coming after us, while they keep tearing everything apart." Henry shook his head. "We'll wait until the morning. They won't expect us to move in daylight." But Kira was already shaking her head. "I'm not waiting," she said. "If this journal has the answers we need, then I'm going to get it, with or without you." Henry stared at her, his expression a mix of frustration and admiration. "You're stubborn," he said finally, "just like your mother." Kira's chest tightened at the mention of her mother, but she didn't back down. "Are you coming or not?" she asked. Henry sighed, pushing himself to his feet with a grimace. "I don't have a choice, do I?" Margaret watched them with a worried expression but didn't try to stop them. "Be careful," she said, "and don't let them catch you." The house loomed in the darkness, its once pristine exterior now weathered and overgrown. Kira felt a strange sense of déjà vu as they approached, though she had never been there before. Henry led the way, his movements careful and deliberate despite the pain etched into his features. "This way," he whispered, gesturing for Kira to follow him around the back. The door was locked, but Henry produced a key from his pocket and turned it silently in the lock. The air inside was cold and heavy, the scent of dust and decay lingering in the shadows. Kira's eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness, and she followed Henry through the house, her footsteps silent on the creaking floorboards. They stopped in a small study, the walls lined with bookshelves and the furniture covered in white sheets. Henry moved to the desk in the corner, his hands trembling slightly as he opened a drawer and pulled out a small, worn leather book. "This is it," he said quietly, holding it out to Kira. She took the journal, her hands shaking as she opened it. The pages were filled with her mother's handwriting, the words flowing in neat, deliberate lines. She flipped through the entries, her heart pounding as she absorbed fragments of Emma's thoughts. "They think they own us. They think they can control us. But I won't let them hurt my child. I know what they've done, and I'll make sure the world knows too. If anything happens to me, the truth is in the garden." Kira frowned, her fingers pausing on the last line. "The garden," she murmured, glancing up at Henry. "What does that mean?" Henry's expression darkened. "She loved the garden," he said. "But it might mean more than that. There's a stone bench outside near the roses. She used to hide things there. They moved quickly, slipping out the back door and into the overgrown garden. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick and heavy. Henry led her to the stone bench, his steps faltering as they approached. Kira knelt beside it, her fingers searching the cracks and crevices until they found a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a sealed envelope, the paper yellowed with age. Kira's hands trembled as she opened it, pulling out a single sheet of paper. Her mother's handwriting covered the page, the words bold and deliberate. "They took everything from us. They'll come for you if you let them. But if you're reading this, it means you're stronger than they ever thought you could be. Don't let them win." Kira stared at the letter, her heart breaking and swelling all at once. For the first time, she felt like she truly understood her mother, not as a distant memory, but as a woman who had fought desperately to protect her. A sound behind them made her freeze. She turned to see shadows moving in the darkness, the glint of a gun catching the faint moonlight. "They found us," Henry whispered, his voice tight. Kira gripped the letter tightly, her jaw set. She wasn't running anymore. This time she would fight. The moon hung low in the sky as Kira stood frozen in the overgrown garden, her pulse pounding in her ears. The letter in her hand felt heavier than paper should, its words burning into her mind like a brand. Don't let them win. Behind her, Henry straightened, his face pale and drawn as the shadows shifted around them. The men who had attacked them earlier had returned, their dark suits blending into the night, their movements silent and calculated. Kira counted 3 of them, each holding the cold menace of someone who was willing to kill without hesitation. "Give me the letter," the lead man said, his voice a low growl. His scarred face twisted in a grimace as he stepped closer, his gun raised and steady. "Hand it over, and we'll make this quick." Henry moved in front of Kira, shielding her with his body. "You're not getting it," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the tension that radiated off him. The man sneered. "Do you really think you're in a position to negotiate, Lawson? You've been meddling in things that don't concern you for long enough. It's time to end this." Kira's hand tightened around the letter. The weight of her mother's words gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. "This is my mother's truth," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "And I'm not giving it to you. Not now. Not ever." The scarred man laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. "Your mother thought she could take us on, too," he said, his tone mocking. "Look how that turned out for her." Rage surged through Kira like wildfire. She stepped out from behind Henry, her glare cutting through the darkness. "She didn't run because she was afraid of you," she said, her voice sharp as steel. "She ran because she knew you'd come after me. But I'm not running." The man's sneer faded, replaced by cold calculation. "Fine," he said, his voice low. "Have it your way." The first shot shattered the stillness of the night, and Henry pulled Kira down just in time. The bullet struck the stone bench behind them, sending shards of rock flying into the air. Kira's heart raced as she scrambled to her feet, clutching the letter tightly. "We need to move," Henry shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the back of the garden. But the men were closing in, their footsteps crunching through the wet grass. Another shot rang out, and Kira felt the air shift as the bullet zipped past her. She stumbled but kept running, Henry's grip on her arm anchoring her as they darted toward the shadows of the tree line. "Go," Henry urged, his voice raw with urgency. "Don't stop." Kira's legs burned as she pushed forward, the trees looming ahead like a sanctuary. She could hear the men behind them, their curses and shouts growing louder as they gained ground. She didn't know how much farther she could go, but she refused to let them catch her. Not with the letter, not with her mother's truth. They reached the edge of the woods, the canopy above swallowing them in darkness. Henry slowed, pulling Kira behind a large oak tree as they caught their breath. His face was pale, his shirt still stained with the blood from his earlier wound. "We can't outrun them," he said, his voice hoarse. "Not like this." Kira's chest heaved as she clutched the letter against her chest. "What do we do?" she whispered. Henry's jaw tightened. "We make a stand." Before she could respond, the underbrush rustled, and the scarred man stepped into view, his gun raised. "End of the line," he said, his grin predatory. "Hand over the letter, and I'll let you die clean." Henry stepped in front of Kira again, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Think about what you're doing. You're fighting to protect men who don't care about you, who would throw you away the second you became inconvenient." The man's grin faltered, but he didn't lower the gun. "Spare me the speech," he snapped. "This isn't about loyalty. It's about survival. And you've just run out of options." Kira felt her heart pounding as her mind raced. She had no weapon, no way to fight back, but she couldn't let them win. Not after everything her mother had sacrificed. Her gaze darted to the trees around them, her thoughts scrambling for a plan. And then she saw a broken branch lying on the ground, sharp and jagged at the end. Without thinking, she lunged for it, grabbing the branch and swinging it with all her strength. The man cried out as the branch struck his arm, the gun falling from his grip. Henry reacted instantly, tackling him to the ground as Kira scrambled to retrieve the weapon. She pointed it at the remaining two men, her hands shaking but her resolve steady. "Stay back," she warned, her voice trembling. The men hesitated, their expressions darkening as they assessed the situation. For a moment, the air was thick with tension, each side waiting for the other to make a move. And then, the distant wail of sirens cut through the silence. The men exchanged a glance, their hesitation breaking. The scarred man shoved Henry off him and barked an order. "Fall back. Let's go." They disappeared into the woods as quickly as they had come, their shadows swallowed by the night. Kira stood frozen, the gun still trembling in her hands as the sirens grew louder. Henry pulled himself to his feet, his movements slow and pained. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Kira nodded, though her entire body felt like it was about to collapse. She lowered the gun, her breaths coming in uneven gasps. Moments later, the sirens stopped, and a pair of police cars screeched to a halt at the edge of the woods. Officers spilled out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they approached. Hours later, Kira sat in the back of an ambulance, a blanket draped over her shoulders. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving her exhausted and shaky. Henry sat beside her, his side patched up by the paramedics but his face lined with worry. "You were brave back there," he said quietly. Kira didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the letter in her hands, the paper now crumpled and damp. She had risked everything to protect it, and now the weight of its contents pressed down on her like a storm cloud. "What happens now?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry hesitated, his expression thoughtful. "Now we fight," he said. "We take this to the people who can expose the truth. Your mother didn't want her story to end in silence, and neither do I." Kira looked at him, her anger and resentment softening just slightly. For so long she had carried the pain of abandonment, the belief that she was alone in the world. But now, for the first time, she felt like she had something to hold on to, a purpose, a connection, a chance to rewrite the story that had shaped her life. She nodded slowly, her grip on the letter tightening. "Then let's finish what she started." In the weeks that followed, Kira and Henry worked together to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy that had destroyed Emma's life. They uncovered documents, recorded testimonies, and shone a light on the people who had operated in the shadows for so long. The journey was grueling, filled with threats and setbacks, but Kira refused to back down. And when the truth finally came to light, When the names of those responsible were splashed across headlines and justice began to take shape, Kira felt a quiet sense of triumph. It wasn't the ending she had imagined, it wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase the scars of the past, but it was enough. Standing in the garden where it had all begun, Kira held the medallion in her hand, the cool metal warm against her skin. She closed her eyes, letting the wind carry her mother's words to her heart. "Don't let them win." "I won't," she whispered, and for the first time in her life she felt free.